Hello students, welcome to the MOOC course on Indian economics. Today I will deliver my lecture on India's foreign trade, its valuation, composition and direction. Now, most of the third world countries have a colonial past, which is marked by intensive and extensive exploitation. And one of the most important tools for this colonial exploitation was foreign trade. Now, foreign trade is basically means exchange of goods and services between different nations in the international market. And this foreign trade enables a country to enjoy the benefits of goods and services which either they do not have or they have in scarcity. Now, the main cause of the exploitation by the colonial power was that the developing countries or the third world countries or the poor countries, we can say, were the consumers of manufacturing goods and final goods, whereas they were the producers of raw materials, agricultural and allied goods. On the other hand, those countries who were developed at that point of time, they were the consumers of agricultural, allied and primary goods, whereas the developed countries were producers of machinery, manufacturing goods and final goods. So as a result, when international trade occurred, the developed countries used to import agricultural commodities and primary goods mainly, and they used to export manufactured final goods, and the opposite happened to the developing countries or the poor countries. That means poor countries used to export agricultural goods or primary goods, and they used to import final goods, manufacturing goods. And as the price of these primary goods and agricultural goods were decreasing over the time, the terms of trade basically was against the developing countries. Now, what is terms of trade? Terms of trade is basically the price ratio of export and import. That means export price by import price. Now, as terms of trade was against the developing countries always opted for inward-oriented policies. In other words, we can say that developing countries used to, or they were encouraged to take import substituting measures, and they were very much pessimistic in the export sector. For example, just after independence, the government of India always said that export sector, India's goods did not have any market in the international market. But the situation have changed during 1960s. The then developing countries, that means Japan, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, they adopted import substitute instead of taking import substitution policies. These countries opted for import promotion, and they were very much successful. And observing their success, many international institutions as well as many economists suggested the developing countries who were facing economic problem to opt for export promotion and promotion measures to rid of their economic problems. And of course, India was not an exceptional situation. In 1991, India took a bold step. It liberalized its economy, and it took many liberalized policies in many sectors, and of course, it took foreign trade policy, which liberalized policy, and this new foreign trade policy of 1991 that raised the total export of India as well as India's share of export in the world market, and of course it found a way to improve the balance of payment crisis of India in the world trade. Now this new policy also changed the export-import policy as well as country-specific and commodity-specific policies were taken from this point of time. Now I will discuss the value of India's foreign trade. The value of India's foreign trade, that means value of India's import and export, have increased substantially over the planning period. Now, I will discuss this over the planning period, which started in 1950s. Now, first I will discuss import, then export. Firstly, India's export also increased first during 1960s or 1950s. That means initial period of planning, India's export was somewhere 1,200 million dollar, which increased to somewhere 3 lakh million dollar. And in case of import, this figure is also during 1950s, the value of import was around $1,200 million, which increased to almost more than 5 lakh million dollar during 2018 and 19. So both the valuation of both export and import both increased dramatically during the planning period. However, the increase in import is much higher than increase in export. That implies that India always faced a trade deficit. And over the planning periods, only in 2 periods in 2 years, India faced trade surplus. That is in 1972-73, another in 1976-77, where the surplus was that was not much more, but it was a small surplus amounting $134 million and $77 million respectively. Otherwise, in the entire period, trade deficit was there. And the more issue of concern was that the deficit was actually increasing over the years. Now, during 1990-91, India faced a huge amount of trade deficit, and that is mainly because during 1989-90, India's import grown at 13% and growth of export was only 9%. So, to remove the problem of excessive trade deficit, import restrictive measures were taken. And obviously, as a result of that, valuation of import reduced by 19%, and this actually affected the India's industrial growth. So again, a new reversed policy India had to take a reversed policy, and in 1992-93, India liberalized the trade import, and as a result of this, valuation of import increased at that point of time. However, the trade situation at that point of time, that means during 92-93, that was better than previous years. The 8th five-year plan, that means from 1990 to 1997, the total trade deficit was actually lower than the trade deficit what prevailed in 6th and 7th five-year plan. Now, during the beginning of 9th five-year plan, that means which started in 1997, the trade situation again deteriorated, and it started to fluctuate over the period. And only in 1999-2000, the figure of import was better. otherwise, in other years of ninth five-year plan, import was very sluggish because of lower domestic demand. Now, after ninth five-year plan, during 10th five-year plan, that means from 2002 to 2007, the trade situation or India's position in world trade was very good. And during 10th five-year plan, the export was always more than 20%. And of course, in 2004-5, that figure was almost 30%. And the reason, of course, there were domestic as well as external reason. And external reasons were improved global trade and world trade increment. Those are the reasons for external improvement. And internally, opening up of the economy and restructuring of the corporate sector are the main two reasons for increasing export of India. And following export, import also increased during 10th five-year plan. The reasons were increasing crude oil price and decreasing or lower tariff rate and buoyant economic problems. Those are the main reasons for import to increase during 10th five-year plan. So, as import was increasing and export was also increasing, but however trade deficit was there, and trade deficit was also increased during 10th five-year plan. Now 11th five-year plan started from 2007, and again it started with trade deficit, and 2008 was another year where recession occurred globally. And that also that obviously we expect that will affect the Indian export, but actually not happened. Indian export was during 2008-9, Indian export was almost 13%. So it was higher than it was a good situation. And the trade deficit was increasing till 2012-13. In from 2014 it started to improve, but again in 2015 and 16 again export import both decreased. And the reasons were of course in case of import the reason were in decreasing oil price bill, and in case of export the falling price of oil and other non-oil commodities like engineering goods, gems and jewelry. Those export products of India, they either reduced in volume or in price. If we compare the figure, the trade deficit of 2022 during the month of April to August, if we compare this figure with the figure of 2021 month is same, that means we compare the months of April to August of 2021 to April to August of 2022, we will see that the trade deficit is much higher in 2022. Composition of foreign trade basically implies composition of export and import. And this composition is very important because it shows us the rate and speed of restructuring of an economy. Now, before the advent of planning in India, the main export items were like jute, tea, cotton, etc. But over the planning period, the situation have been changed drastically, mainly because of industrialization. Now, I will discuss the composition in two parts. First is composition of imports. During 1947-48, that means just after independence, India used to import all types of machinery goods, machinery goods, waste, woods, etc. And there are many goods which I have mentioned in my notes. And all these goods contributed almost 70% of the total import in India. Now, the important point I will mention, first of all, in case of India, the import of POL items, that means petroleum, oil and lubricants, has increased substantially over the period, and mainly it increased from 1960s to 1980s. But after that, India explored some method to produce its own oil products, petroleum products. As a result of this, after that, the percentage of import of POL items or POL goods have reduced. Now, another important commodity of import of India is non-ferrous metal item, which contributed almost 10% of the total import of India. And another important commodity is electronic goods. And the other most important is gems and jewelry. Its demand is increasing over the years in India, and as a result, pearls, precious and semi-precious jewelry, import of this jewelry have increased substantially in India, and its current position is second after POL commodities. Now, India's most important item during 1960 for export was jute, and after 1960s its importance has reduced. And during 1960, the second most important item for export was tea. It lost its importance after 1970s. Presently, the most important item for export is the engineering goods. Its importance has increased after the second five-year plan, which emphasized on the industrialization. So, during 2018 and 19 and present, that means in 2020, 21, 22, the most important or most first item for export is engineering goods. Now, the second important commodity is the petroleum products, which export of which has increased dramatically in recent years. And the reason, or it implies that the refining capacity of India has increased very recently. And the third important commodity for export is the gems and jewelry, that means Indian gems and jewelry. Now, during pre-independent India, direction of foreign trade did not depend on its gains from trade. It depends on that means it did not depend on the comparative advantage of the country, but it depend on the relationship between UK and its allied. And this trend, of course, remained after independence, and because India did not understand its comparative advantage. During 1960s also, India used to depend on UK and USA for its trade. And during that point of time, almost 80% trade was between India, UK and USA. But after that, that means after 6 decades or 60 years or 75 years of independence, the scene have been changed dramatically. While going to discuss this direction of imports, I will divide the whole country into 5 groups. One is OECD countries, that means Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Second one is OPEC countries, which implies Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Third one is Eastern European countries. fourth one is developing countries and others. Now, at the beginning of planning period, that means during 1960s or end of 50s, OECD countries was important in India's export. It contributed almost about 78% during that point of time, but it lost its importance, and currently almost approximately 27% of total import is imported from OECD countries. Now, during the planning period, the OPEC countries, that means Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, has increased or improved for India's import. This implies that India's dependence on petroleum products has increased over the years. And the trade relation of with the socialist countries, that means the Eastern European countries, has increased, and it was during 1960s it was merely 3% or so, which increased up to 1991. And after that, due to setback of the communist countries, especially the USSR, from their group, that means from the from the Eastern European group, the import from Eastern European countries has decreased, and import from the developing countries has increased dramatically, and it is currently it is almost 46% of the total import of India. During 1950s, which I have already mentioned, that India's maximum amount of import was from United Kingdom, and that means UK, and that was followed by USA. And during the planning period, the scenario has changed, and over the entire planning period, India imported most of the commodities from USA, because it imported capital goods, intermediate goods, and food grains. And during the reform period, that means economic reform which occurred in India in 1990 and 1991, USA was first in import. That means India was importing maximum commodities from United States, and that was followed by Germany, Japan, UK, Saudi Arabia, and Belgium. And in 2021, China got the first position, and that means India is importing maximum of its commodities from China, and followed by USA, UAE, and Switzerland. Now I will discuss the direction of India's export. And direction of India's export, obviously, previously India was exporting most of its commodities to either UK or US, and now I will discuss this direction also by dividing the countries into 5 categories, which I mentioned previously. That means I will categorize, or I will group the countries in OECD, OPEC, and Eastern European countries, developing country, and other countries. Now, over the years, India's export to the OECD countries has also decreased, like the imports. And OPEC group, export to the OPEC group, that also increased. And during 2021-22, its percentage were 12%. The most significant was the rapid increase of India's export to the Eastern European countries. And during 1960s, the percentage was 7%, that increased to almost 22% in 1980-81. And after that, its percentage reduced due to some political upheavals, and in recent years, the war between Russia and Ukraine, that has also decreased the percentage of India's export to the Eastern European countries. In 2022, India export only 1% of its product to these Eastern European countries. The most significant again is the developing countries. Like import, India's export has also increased dramatically to these developing countries. The percentage of India's total export to these developing countries is almost 44%. Now I will discuss country wise. During 1950s, again India used to export most of its commodity to either UK or USA, which reflects the colonial heritage of our country. And the other socialist or capitalist countries, they were not at all interested about the Indian products. But the scenario changed, and during the reform period, the first position, that means India used to export its maximum product to the USSR, and that was followed by USA. And in 2021, USA is in the first position. That means India export its maximum product to USA, then followed by UAE, China, and Hong Kong. Foreign trade is a crucial factor for uplifting the standard of living of a country. In this module, I have discussed how the value composition and direction of India's foreign trade has changed over the years, specifically over the planning periods. And the discussion shows that there was significant change over the years, especially after the reform period, that means after 1991. And above all, most importance or most significant was that the emergence of China, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, these countries from the developing countries, and Switzerland from the OECD countries, and UAE and Indonesia from the OPEC countries as the trade partner of India. Now, during the period of our foreign minister Jaishankar, and there were many foreign trade policies were taken, and this has improved Indian position in the global trade. And in 2021, the new trade policy for 2021 to 26 has been taken, which of course aimed at improving the India's leadership in the global trade in the coming years.